Hello, Kai 2023. I'm John Dunham with the Niantic RIT GeoGames Lab. Today I'll be talking about building positively effective location-based game advertising. Before delving into location-based game advertising, we should first talk about advertising in games in general. The Interactive Advertising Bureau has identified three classifications of advertising in relation to games: custom branded games, around game ads, and in-game ads. Each of these three classifications represent different levels of integration between the advertising and the game. Custom branded games are usually games that have been commissioned by an advertiser, such as serial promotion classic Chex Quest, a reskin of the Ultimate Doom. Such advertising is generally the most integrated, as the game itself is the advertisement. Around game ads can be pre-rolled advertising, banner ads, pop-in advertisements, anything along those lines. Typically, this is a very low level of integration, as shown in this case, where Congregate, the hosting site of the game, can serve the ad without interaction from the game. In-game ads, the focus of this presentation and study, represent a middle ground between these two techniques. The advertisements are diegetically embodied into the game, such as sponsored locations in Pokémon GO. Sponsored locations represent one of two advertising techniques employed by Pokémon GO. Through this modality, businesses are able to make their physical location a point of interest in the game, a sort of digital billboard, if you will. Visually and mechanically, these are all but identical to standard points of interest, save the purple indicator visible on the game map in a sponsored label when the players interact with the point of interest. Pokémon GO has two types of points of interest: stops and gyms, both of which provide the user with resources to play the game. However, the main difference is that gyms are the site of playful antagonism through gym challenges and communal play through raiding. Stops provide you with quests and missions that are not dependent necessarily upon points of interest. The other in-game ad present in Pokémon GO is the sponsored supply balloon. These balloons are somewhat analogous to pop-ups that the player has the option to interact with. If the player taps the balloon, they are showed who is sponsoring the balloon and then can open the attached gift to get in-game resources. In exchange for those resources, the player is then shown a brief 3-second advertisement, which can be saved for future reference. Both techniques are minimally intrusive and allow the player to determine if they wish to interact with the in-game advertisements. While Pokémon GO leverages in-game advertising, it also integrates it with location-aware technology central to the game's core mechanics. By making advertisements points of interest or balloons, advertisers are able to embed their messaging into the game so it only reaches players who can actionably interact with it. This form of direct marketing mirrors traditional location-based advertising such as billboards or mailing campaigns. However, as the affordances are entirely digital, they can be implemented at a fraction of the cost in location-based game advertising. Pokémon GO has implemented some form of this advertising modality since its launch in 2016, starting with campaigns where both McDonald's and Starbucks locations were made into game points of interest. For those brands, location-based game advertising was clearly beneficial. However, there is little literature exploring the effects of the advertising on players of the game. Acknowledging this lacuna, we identified three core research questions that we wanted to explore in the space of location-based game advertising. In addition to understanding whether or not the advertisement was effective, we also wanted to comprehend what kinds of advertisements were positively effective. Since location-based games are ludic experiences, there exists a tension between the need for monetization and the wants and needs of its players. To explore this tension in our research questions, we designed a qualitative study to understand the lived experiences of players of our pro game, Pokémon GO. To achieve this, we leveraged a semi-structured interview talking to 27 participants in interviews lasting approximately 45 minutes. To analyze the data, we leveraged an inductive technique where researchers independently coded the interviews. We then collaboratively discussed these codes to generate a cohesive thematic framework, which brings us to our findings. Location-based game advertising in Pokémon GO leverages points of interest. As such, we determined comprehending how our participants remembered places in the game was important. Above all else, repeated exposure to a location was directly related to the participants' ability to remember the locations. In fact, some wouldn't even bother to remember locations if they felt they wouldn't be back in the area. Additionally, locations that had more places to play the game, i.e. dense points of interest, were more likely to be memorable to our participants. Participants would tend to return to these types of locations to play the game, as it's easier to play in an area with several points of interest within walking distance. Participants generally considered playing on or near private property to be a taboo, and as such avoid playing in these places, reducing chances for exposure. When points of interest either had a bad photo or didn't quite match their surrounding locations, typically in the form of out-of-season pictures, they tended to stand out to our participants. Generally speaking, when the photo of the point of interest matched with a real-world location, players had a more positive experience with that spot. When it comes to actually advertising to the participants, however, they held one thing above all else: personal control of their experiences. Participants wanted to have the choice to interact with advertisements in this game. This desire for choice is particularly exacerbated by the design of location-based games. Most interactions within the game are typically incidental and brief. Players typically play this game to pass time on commutes, occupy their mind while walking the dog, or even while waiting in line in the grocery store. In each of these circumstances, players are not solely engaged with the game, and as such, the player's intent must be translated to action rapidly, otherwise it becomes impossible to play the game. In short, the players need to maintain their personal agency. If advertisements interrupt this flow and force players to engage with them, players have a tendency to become frustrated, as noted by participants when describing their experiences with other mobile games that did not afford the player agency over their advertising choices. In the best case scenario, the advertisement is ignored. In the worst, the player is angry at their advertiser and game for thwarting their play. Interestingly, affording the participants the opportunity to interact with the advertisement enhances their agency, increasing perceptions of favorability for some. Although those participants did expect that interaction with the advertisement netted them some reward. In fact, participants expected that there was the presence of a value exchange, for example, trading in-game time for in-game rewards. Embedded in most ads is an inherent nuisance cost, meaning the more annoying an advertisement is, the more that must be done to offset it in order to keep players happy. When a player is allowed to choose to interact with the advertisement, this nuisance cost is at least partially reduced, although not entirely eliminated. If the reward for the advertisement is not sufficient to overcome the time spent watching the advertisement and interfering with the game, players will not interact, making it worthless to the advertiser. As such, when tuning the value exchange, developers and advertisers should lean towards giving better rewards, whether they be increased items or real-world items. Thank you for your time.